Okay, so we are now recording. Great. Okay, so let's perhaps we should make a start then. Okay, so well, I'll start off. My name is Will Sillett, so I'm one of the team members of the psychology department at Essex University Online. I'm very happy to introduce our very first guest speaker, Professor Viv Burr. Viv is Professor of Critical Psychology at Huddersfield University, and I'm sure many of you know she's the author of a lot of books, or quite a few books, very highly regarded books, also on the topic of social constructionism, which is a sort of a philosophical approach that aims to understand the processes by which humans create or construct the meaning of the world in which they live. I'll let Viv tell you more about that. Her lecture today is a really perfect introduction for anyone thinking of undertaking a qualitative research project and wishing to reflect on what a qualitative approach is all about. In her own work, Viv and her colleagues are currently researching the personal meanings of outdoor spaces during lockdown. So that sounds interesting. You may well have come across some of her books. You will find her on psychology department reading lists, across the globe. And I first came across Viv when I was a student in Finland, and I remember picking up one of her books off the shelf in Helsinki. So that's when I first came across Viv's work. So yeah, very much an internationally renowned or known figure. Before I do hand over to Viv, I just want to mention that, well, first of all, we are recording this, so just be aware of that. Also, I'd like to mention that any questions you might have for Viv, what we'll do is we will, if you could type those into the chat box, and myself and one or two colleagues will be monitoring the chat box. And if we might throw that question at Viv, almost as soon as you ask it, if it's relevant. Or we might save that question to the very end and put that question to her at the very end of the lecture. So that's how we're going to try and do this. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is, as well as just refrain from just putting your microphone on and just asking a question. Try to use the chat box as the medium through which we direct the questions. So there's a lot of us online today. I'll do my best to, edit or choose the points that we want to put to Viv at the end. But anyway, I think I've said enough. I'd like now to pass over to Viv and allow her to introduce you to this amazing topic she's going to discuss today. Viv.
Thank you very much, Will. What a lovely introduction. And thank you everybody for coming to hear my lecture today. I'm delighted to be speaking to students and staff at the University of Essex. And just to reiterate what Will has said, this is an introductory style lecture. So what I'm aiming to do is to introduce you to the key assumptions of this approach that's come to be called social constructionism, and just fleshing out some of the implications of adopting this approach for how we do psychology. I'd like to begin with a brief account of what is now a classic experiment that was carried out by Bruner and Goodman in 1947 in the USA. They asked 10-year-old children to estimate the size of coins from memory by using some apparatus that allowed them to expand or contract a circle of light until it seemed to them the right size. They compared two groups of children, both drawn from schools in the neighborhood of Boston, but one was from a relatively rich neighborhood and the other was from a school in a poor area of the same city. And what they found was that the poor children overestimated the size of every coin, significantly more than the rich children did. Now, it seems extraordinary to us that our perceptions of the physical world, things like coins, can seemingly be distorted by our social location. And mainstream psychology, I think, has difficulty in explaining things like this. Now, I'm not going to say any more about that just at the moment. I'm going to return to this experiment at the end of my lecture and ask whether social constructionism might be able to help us to understand such things. So just a bit about social constructionism itself and where it came from. As a theoretical framework in psychology, and particularly social psychology, social constructionism arose in the latter part of the 20th century in Europe and North America. And it emerged as a critical voice, challenging the fundamental assumptions of mainstream psychology. And it's often been adopted as the preferred theoretical perspective of psychologists and social psychologists who regard the mainstream discipline of psychology and social psychology as deeply problematic. Now, in this lecture, I'm going to explain what features of mainstream psychology they challenge and why they do this, describe the alternative viewpoint that social constructionism offers, and discuss the radical implications of this perspective for how we understand what being a person means. Now, social constructionism might be seen as part of what's come to be called the turn to language in psychology and especially social psychology in the mid-20th century, where the relationship between language and thought was questioned. The idea that language is simply a transparent vehicle for describing our thoughts and emotions and so on, for describing inner psychological states and transferring them into the external world. So it also drew on the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which you may or may not have heard on, that suggests that not only does language, does thought not produce language, but that it's the other way around. The structure of our language determines what we can perceive and think about and how we categorize our experience. It's also part of what came to be called the crisis in social psychology, again starting in around the 1960s, where there was a sense that the predominant experimental paradigm, the kind of positivist approach to doing psychology that's been prevalent really ever since the early to mid 20th century, that this was not giving us great insight into the psychology of human beings, that our knowledge was not adding up to anything very significant. Now, if we consult any student textbook, we'll see that psychology clearly and enthusiastically presents itself as a science. In our contemporary world, science means progress. Science is our route to the discovery of truth. And the Western passion that we have for and belief in science goes back several hundred years to the time of the Enlightenment in Europe, the late 17th to mid 18th centuries. Now, this was an era of questioning, of travel, exploration, a time of discovery through the development of what we now call scientific method, the dispassionate, methodical, and rigorous observation and recording of phenomena. The Enlightenment era stood against the religious dogma of earlier times, when the truth was the preserve of religious leaders, and the truths that they dispensed were never questioned or challenged by ordinary people. Now, with the invention of the printing press and the subsequent spread of literacy, we get the idea that people should perhaps make up their own minds about the world and how it works, and that the basis for our judgment should be observable scientific evidence rather than the received wisdoms of religious leaders. And as this belief in the power of scientific knowledge to reveal to us the nature of the physical world became increasingly predominant, it seemed quite possible that science could also help us discover the nature and workings of the human mind, the facts about human nature. And psychologists way back in the early decades of the 20th century, 100 years ago, were keen to establish their scientific credentials with the adoption of controlled laboratory experiments as their preferred method. They were They were keen to reveal to the world the truth about people, the facts about people. However, despite the very praiseworthy intentions of the Enlightenment period and the undeniable benefits that science has brought us, it may be argued that science today has adopted a rather similar role to the religious dictators that it wanted to replace, providing us with facts and truths for our consumption, rather than encouraging a questioning and skeptical stance to our taken for granted truths. The foundation stones of scientific method bring with them what I will argue are some rather problematic concepts. Concepts such as truth, fact, knowledge, and progress, concepts that are challenged by social constructionism. These concepts become particularly problematic when we start to apply them to people. Scientific method rests on the assumption that if we observe some aspect of the world methodically and rigorously, it will reveal its true nature to us. And this assumption, in turn, rests upon another assumption, that the world has a true nature that can be discovered. For the last few hundred years, scientists have been telling us what the world consists of and how it works. And psychologists, over the most recent of those centuries, have been doing the same thing on the topic of human beings. They have offered us many facts about people, often accompanied by the authoritative phrase, "we now know that." For example, we all know now that we all carry within us different quantities of personality traits, and that these traits account for the things that we like and things that we don't like to do. They've told us that one of these traits is something called intelligence, and that this is something that some people have more than others, and that we can measure it with IQ tests, and that most of our intelligence is inherited from our parents. And with the rise of neuroscience, psychologists' explanations of our nature have tended more and more towards the idea that many aspects of our nature are what's come to be termed hardwired, built into our genetic material or our brain structure, making psychology an increasingly reductionist discipline, where we're encouraged to understand complex psychological and social phenomena in terms of neurological activity. And a whole industry of psychometric testing has been based upon the invention of tools for measuring the qualities and characteristics that we are thought to carry. One website that I visited offered hundreds of practice psychometric tests for people who wanted to practice doing psychometric tests, perhaps in advance of a job interview. The problem is that many so-called facts about people often don't work in their best interests. Measures of various supposed psychological qualities are based on particular and local assumptions and values, although they're presented as neutral and value-free. When intelligence tests were developed in the early 20th century and began to be widely used for assessing children's potential, intelligence turned out to be unevenly distributed across society. Working class children and Black children turned out to be less able than their white middle class peers. Now, there was, of course, a great deal of interest in why these children were less intelligent, with some explanations drawing on prevailing racist ideas, and others focusing on the notion of deprivation and the relatively less intellectually enriched home environments of these children. But rather less attention was paid to the argument made by some critics of IQ tests, that the tests were devised by white middle-class men. And like most other scientists in the UK and Europe, psychologists were largely white, middle-class and men. And inevitably, these tests reflected their culture and values, what they thought the abilities of an intelligent person ought to be. Another example is the difficulty today that many women still experience in being accepted into traditionally male areas of employment. The idea persists that women are not suited to men's work because they don't have the right qualities. But just as definitions of intelligence were built on the abilities of a narrow range of people, assumptions about gender differences have become part of how we actually define some work roles. For example, the concept of the good manager may be bound up with male values and male perspectives on the workplace. So redressing gender imbalances in the workplace doesn't necessarily mean just trying to get more women to do men's jobs as they're currently defined, but redefining, that is reconstructing, our concept of the good manager and other work roles. So what we regard as knowledge is anything but impartial and value-free. In fact, the French philosopher and historian Michel Foucault, who's been a strong influence on many social constructionists, including myself, he regarded knowledge and power as an inseparable couple. Now, he wasn't arguing that the more knowledge that you acquire, the more opportunities or power that you have. Instead, he argued that knowledge is always an exercise of power, and power is always a function of knowledge. So this is the first of the key features of social constructionism that I want to get across to you. Knowledge and facts, especially those relating to people, are never value-free or apolitical. Knowledge and power are intertwined. So it's no coincidence that white middle-class men, who are a relatively powerful group in our society, that these people have produced what we call our knowledge, including our psychological knowledge, of course, knowledge about others that confirms their inferiority and justifies their relatively lower status in society. Now, it's important to point out that this is not necessarily consciously done, although of course it might be. It's just that our own understanding of people just seems natural or obviously true. Our own way of looking at and thinking about the world just seems more valid. And that's whether you're a white middle-class man or not. But of course, if you're a white middle-class man, you're in a position of power to disseminate your view of the world where others may not be. What we call facts or knowledge are also always a result of particular people asking particular questions for a particular reason. So the second fundamental assumption of social constructionism that I want you to think about is that it challenges our ideas of objectivity, fact, and truth. It argues that there's no such thing as a hard objective fact. Facts are always the product of asking some questions rather than others, and of the unquestioned assumptions that we make about the world. In other words, the perspective we take. Now, the search for the truth about people is at the heart of psychology, and its agenda too reflects vested interests and unquestioned assumptions about the world. Facts are never value-free, so we can say that the claims to value freedom made by psychology are political acts masquerading as neutral information. All facts come from seeing the world from some perspective or other. Scientists are only human, like everyone else, and cannot transcend their location in time and space. When they do their research and ask their research questions, they bring the baggage of their perspective on the world with them. Within social constructionism, we cannot argue that some people are biased or wrong in the way they perceive the world. To make that argument, we'd have to believe that there is an unbiased or accurate way of perceiving it that we could call the truth. Social constructionism takes the view, which is a philosophical position, that such a truth or objective reality does not exist. Or at the very least, if it does exist, it's simply unavailable to us. We must accept that what exists for us are multiple and diverse constructions of the world. Of course, people who share a society or a culture will inevitably have in common some fundamental perceptions or assumptions about the world. Private property is a good example. In capitalist societies, we tend to see property as a kind of fact. It seems simply a fact that some things belong to me and some things belong to you. And we share a language of ownership, of borrowing and theft. But it is possible to conceive of a society without private property, where such ideas would ultimately have no practical or social meaning. And throughout history, our commonly held beliefs about the world and about people have changed radically. For example, our conception of the nature and the needs of children, the origins of hallucinations and voice hearing, and the workings of the physical body. So the third fundamental assumption of social constructionism that I want to talk to you about is the historical and cultural specificity of knowledge. The idea that the world and the people in it should not be thought of as consisting of discoverable facts about them, but that we as human beings create the world as we perceive it from the vantage point of our location in it. And this inevitably means that there can never be a single accurate truth about the world or people. Instead, there are multiple perspectives, multiple accounts, all competing for the labels of truth and fact. Mainstream psychology assumes that our knowledge is good for all times and all places. But it seems that what we understand to be true about the social world or facts about people varies historically and culturally. Of course, it's easy to explain this by saying that our knowledge or understanding of the world and people now is simply better, more accurate than it was a decade ago or a century ago. And we could say that our understanding of the world and people here, wherever here is better or more accurate than ways of understanding in other parts of the world. But social constructionism asks us to question this assumption and to consider the possibility that what exists are multiple perspectives on the world. And although some may be more useful than others, it cannot be said that any of them is the truth. Social constructionism criticizes mainstream psychology for being imperialist and colonizing. It assumes that Western ways of seeing the world are right, and these then become imposed on others. The version of psychology that grew up in the USA and Europe has arguably now been transplanted into other cultures where it's not native, but it's flourishing and colonizing indigenous ways of thinking. For the social constructionist, the differences and changes in our knowledge across time and place indicate that our knowledge is a product of social and cultural change. What something is a social matter, not a matter of objective fact. For example, we're used to thinking of age categories as somehow naturally occurring. We readily divide people into infants, children, adolescents, teenagers, young adults, the middle-aged and the old. And psychologists have documented in various ways what they regard as the key features of people at each life stage. But these particular age categories are a very recent phenomenon. What we call teenagers did not exist before the middle of the 20th century. Teenagers emerged as a group as young people became more affluent, more able to buy their own music and their own clothes, and youth subcultures developed with their own norms and values. Today, encouraged by the subdiscipline of developmental psychology, we're used to thinking of children as a category of people with needs and capabilities that are quite different from those of adults. However, even in the developed world, this is a relatively recent phenomenon. Childhood was not previously understood as a separate stage of life until the 15th century. And children were seen as small adults who shared the same activities and clothes as their parents. Parenting was characteristically emotionally detached because children often died. And it's only since improvements in health and infant survival rates in more modern times that we've seen the emergence of the idea that children are vulnerable and in need of protection, and as having particular cognitive capacities and emotional needs. The social constructionist argument is that the categories and concepts that we use are historically and culturally specific. They are constructed categories and concepts that we use based on issues and comparisons that seem important to us for our purposes. So in different historical periods, we just see things through different lenses. But for the constructionist, the danger is that we frame these shifts in understanding as progress. We write them into a forward-pointing narrative where the eventual end point is a perfect and accurate description of the world. There's a form of arrogance at the heart of such thinking, that we now, today, here, have the most accurate understanding of the world that there has ever been, and that it's more correct than those understandings of people in earlier times and of people in other places in the world. There's also arguably an intellectual imperialism lying at the heart of our thinking that brings with it the intellectual colonization of other cultures. The discipline of psychology, with its model of human beings as they're understood by psychologists, a model developed by white middle-class men in capitalist societies, is now being spread across the globe. I want to go on to illustrate the constructive force of the discipline of psychology through the example of psychopathology. Contemporary life is arguably a time of exponential growth in what has been referred to as the pathologization of everyday life. More and more aspects of our experience are being presented back to us as psychological pathologies. The DSM, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was introduced in 1952, and it is psychology's expanding record of the great variety of pathologies that have been discovered, apparently, in human beings. And I say discovered in that way to kind of put it in verbal scare quotes. And it's a key resource for psychiatrists. In recent times, we've seen an explosion in pathologies that would have been unfamiliar to people only a few decades ago, and many of which are now recognized in the DSM. Things like autism, ADHD, dyslexia, anorexia nervosa. Recent additions to the DSM version 5 include hoarding disorder, binge eating disorder, somatic symptom disorder, that's worrying about your health, addiction and hypersexual disorder. Interestingly, homosexuality was removed from the DSM in 1974. Prior to this time, homosexuality was classified as a disease in the DSM. But following changes in social attitudes and campaigning by gay activists, the American Psychiatric Association voted to remove it. One indication that diseases are not simply objectively defined medical entities they are social ones. Before the release of the DSM-5 in 2013, a news article bore this headline: "Abnormal is the new normal. Why will half of the US population have a diagnosable mental disorder?" Each successive edition of the DSM has increased the overall number of disorders. The DSM-1 from 1952 listed 106. Version 3 from 1980 listed 265. And the DSM-5 has 297. So more and more aspects of our psychological and social functioning, which might previously have been seen as lying at the margins of normality, something like eccentricity, are now diagnosable pathologies. Critical psychologists regard this continuing, this continuing trend as part of what Foucault called disciplinary power, which he wrote about in two of his works, The Birth of the Clinic and Madness and Civilization. Rather than control the populace by force, he argued that modern societies create an orderly and docile population by encouraging self-regulation. We're all encouraged to ask ourselves, am I normal? And to seek to bring our experience and our behavior in line with current social expectations. And for many people who have a diagnosis, this diagnosis is such that their lives come under the control of powerful others, doctors, psychiatrists, clinical psychologists, people who have the right to take away their freedom, perhaps, by sectioning them, and to insist that they receive drug treatments and invasive procedures. Of course, some of these arguments were already made way back in the 1960s by what came to be known as the anti-psychiatry movement in the USA. For example, in 1960, Thomas Szasz wrote The Myth of Mental Illness. And in 1961, the sociologist Irving Goffman wrote Asylums. But this trend towards pathologization of the individual person leads us to the final feature of social constructionism that I want to explain, and that's anti-essentialism. I'm going to illustrate this through the example of disability and the case of an increasingly commonplace learning disorder, dyslexia. When I started teaching a long, long time ago, there were no dyslexic students, and I mean that in a very social constructionist sense, as you'll see. There were none. Dyslexia was rarely heard of. However, today, every year, many dyslexic students receive disability support, for example, through extra time in exams or getting support for writing essays. How do we explain this? Perhaps dyslexia is a new disorder that people previously just didn't suffer from. It's something that's come about more recently. Or perhaps it was always there, but just wasn't recognized. The social constructionist view is that it's neither of these things. A problem or a difficulty is only a problem for someone in the context of the demands made upon them by their society. Now, in times before general literacy, before ordinary people were expected to read and write, dyslexia did not and could not exist. The education system arguably produces dyslexic students through its literacy demands, through the demands that everybody reads and writes in a particular way to a particular standard. This demand produces dyslexic students. And dyslexia's status as a diagnosable learning difficulty is encouraged and produced through power relations within the educational system, where students compete for relatively rare resources such as university places and jobs. Now, there are many things that I find it very difficult to do. I'm very poor at administrative tasks. I'm very clumsy, too clumsy to play sports very effectively. Also, I'm right-handed, so writing with my left hand is difficult. Do I have a diagnosable disability? Well, no, I don't think I do. However, if society insisted that left-handed writing was normal and everybody had to do it, then I would have a difficulty. And if everything went well, there would be trained specialists ready to diagnose my difficulty and to entitle me to academic support, because I would be lagging behind my peers who found left-handed writing less problematic. Social constructionism argues that disability is not a quality of the person. It is a constructed product of the way that society operates. It is social rather than individual. And it shows up the way that normality is constantly constructed in the image of the relatively powerful people in society. Anti-essentialism means that we should not look inside people for explanations of psychological and social phenomena, but to the relations between people and the society and the culture in which they live. In the case of the many personality type terms that we may use to describe a person, terms like caring or cruel, friendly or shy, generous or selfish, these terms only make sense in the context of the social world. We cannot meaningfully be any of these things without other people around us. We cannot be caring without somebody to care for. We cannot be friendly without somebody to be friends with. So it may be more helpful to think of such things existing not inside people, but between people, inside their relationship with each other. In addition, not all cultures explain behavior in the same terms as mainstream Western psychology. For example, in terms of their personality traits or their attitudes. Cross-cultural research suggests that these concepts may be particularly Western constructions, and that in other parts of the world, people may explain their own and others' conduct in terms of the situation that they find themselves in, or the social norms governing the situation, or the person's social role. The principles of anti-essentialism and the historical and cultural specificity of knowledge have radical implications for psychology. They mean that psychology's current ways of conceptualizing the person in terms of structures like personality traits, attitudes, drives, motivations, and mental illnesses do not refer to objective entities which we have discovered. Instead, they are social constructions that are rather like contemporary myths. They're ways of thinking about and talking about people that bring with them particular possibilities and limitations. Social constructionists refer to these ways of thinking as discourses, because they're produced by us in the course of social life, and in particular through our use of language and other symbolic forms. This means that as psychologists, we can no longer explain a person's behavior by pointing to their attitudes or motivations or other mental structures. Like the behaviorist psychologists of the 20th century, social constructionists regard such constructs as explanatory fictions. This was a term I think that Skinner used to talk about mental structures. The person, therefore, becomes emptied of all the familiar psychological content. So how are we to understand our subjectivity, our psychological life? How are we to understand our thoughts and feelings and behavior? Social constructionism argues that it is discourses that provide the shape and form of what it is possible for us to be. They are powerful representations circulating in societies, and we're immersed in them through our conversations, through our use of social media, through our reading, through our watching television and films. We're constantly immersed in discourses of age, of sexuality, of ethnicity, and many, many other aspects of our identities. And we must take up some position or other within these discourses. For example, until quite recently in Western societies, the only positions within the discourse of sexuality were heterosexual or homosexual. It wasn't possible meaningfully to be anything else. But today, the array of possible sexualities is greater. Bisexual, transsexual, and others have been added to the list of positions that we can adopt in relation to sexuality. But what we cannot do is to refuse to take up a position. We will be positioned by others within discourses of sexuality, and our choice is only to accept or resist the position we're offered. Harre and van Langenhove in 1999 argue that it's our subject positions within discourses that provide our subjectivity. Once we take up a position, we inevitably come to see the world from that perspective, just as we can only perceive the physical world from where we are physically standing. For example, the birth of a child means that the parents take up positions within the discourses of motherhood and fatherhood. Now, these identities can scarcely be ignored. The person cannot now avoid recognizing themselves as the person addressed by advertisements for baby milk, family cars, or healthy meals. The discourse of motherhood calls out to the new mother, calling her into a position from which she must now regard herself and the world. But discourses of motherhood do not offer comfortable positions for all women. In my Western world, the idealized image of the perfect mother is white, young, and middle class, like the woman in the picture. Women who do not bear these characteristics, women who are older or black or poor, may struggle to achieve legitimate identities as good mothers and may need to work hard to resist the position of bad mother. For example, older mothers who have their first babies over the age of 35 often have to find ways of presenting themselves as good mothers in the face of the prevailing view that women of that age are risking the health of their babies by delaying motherhood. So discourses are enmeshed in power relations and often shore up inequalities. Within the social constructionist view, then, we are all socially constructed, made out of the subject positions in discourse that we occupy. Our subjectivity arises from these positions, not from hypothetical mental structures and personality traits. But this does not mean that we're simply the puppets of discourse being manipulated by social forces beyond our awareness. Human beings appear unique in their capacity for reflection on their experience, their ability to represent it to themselves and to other people in public and private language. We have the ability to imagine a state of affairs that is not here and now, and therefore to envisage future outcomes from a range of different possible actions that we might take. This is something that the philosopher and sociologist George Mead recognized, and it was central in his idea of symbolic interactionism, which he developed from the work of Herbert Blumer. Our capacity for reflection upon our experience and on possible futures gives us choice and agency. We can consider the positions within discourses that are on offer to us and choose to accept or resist these, constructing ourselves in the process. Social constructionism means that our subjectivity and our identity, our self, is understood in quite a different way to within mainstream psychology. The unified and coherent self arising supposedly from our personality, attitudes, beliefs, and values is replaced by a self that is fragmented, distributed across the discursive positions that it's called into, and fluid, constantly in a state of flux and change as it shifts between different subject positions in different discourses and is caught up in different social relationships. So where does this leave the discipline of psychology, which has for decades been focused on exploring the nature and origins of the self? Where does it leave the projects of trait and type psychology, psychometrics, and other forms of psychology that assume the existence of various kinds of content to the person, whether that's provided by nature or by the environment? These forms of psychology, I believe, have no place in a socially constructed view of the person. Instead, psychology becomes the project of understanding how people construct themselves and understanding the resources that they use to do this. These resources include both the discourses within which the person occupies a position, but also their experiences and the personal meaning they draw from their experience, which of course leads to the valuing for qualitative methods and methods that have arisen particularly from constructionist approaches, such as discourse analysis. It means that everyone is a constructionist. We're all busy reflecting on and making sense of our experience and constructing ourselves in the process. It's for these reasons that I'm personally drawn to personal construct psychology, or PCP, one of the less well-known theories to emerge from North America. PCP is by no means new. It was developed in the mid-20th century, but it remains for me the only form of psychology that I believe is completely compatible with a social constructionist view of the person. Within PCP, there is no essential nature to people, no content that's either hardwired by our biology or made part of us by our environment. Instead, people construct themselves by drawing meaning from their experiences, and this means that people have agency. We have the power to choose the kind of person we want to be. If we're unhappy with the self that we've created, we have the power to recreate ourselves. Now, this does not mean that change is easy. Change often means painfully unpicking the threads of the self that we've woven over many years, perhaps many decades, and weaving them together into a different pattern. But it does mean that we do not have to feel trapped within our personalities or continue to suffer as the inevitable victims of past traumas. The social constructionist attention to powerful discourses as important for our personal identity and sense of self also means that we're invited to look beyond our own psychological characteristics to understand our, to reflect on the social conditions is impacting upon our subjectivity, and to challenge where we feel for us. And finally, it means acknowledging, sorry, I need to go back to the previous slide, yes. So personal construct psychology then means people have no essential nature. They construct themselves, they have agency and choice, and that personal change is possible. And it's therefore a constructivist theory. Now, you may read about the differences between constructivism and constructionism, and there isn't time to go into the moment, but regardless of the differences between constructivism and constructionism in their focus, I still believe that personal constructs logical end of the theory. So whereas constructivism emphasizes the construct person, social constructionism emphasizes the constructive force of discourse and power relations. I believe that social constructionism could certainly benefit from taking into itself some of the lessons of constructivist psychologists like PCP. But it also means, finally, that we have to acknowledge that psychological theories are not final descriptions of human nature. Rather, they're narratives specific to their time and culture. The ways of conceptualizing the person that we find in any society or culture are indeed a product of that society or culture. Psychology, therefore, can't discover the truth about human nature because there is no single ultimate truth. Because the constructions of particular individuals or groups cannot be regarded as any more truthful or accurate than those of others, it means that psychologists too have no privileged account of the truth. I'd like to know entered a radical challenge for the psychological understanding of perception. Psychologists had thought of perceptions as internal representations of the real world. It was imagined that our perceptual systems present us with a more or less accurate copy of the world as it really is. And we must explain how it can be that people's perceptions are often not accurate, but a distortion of the real world. Instead, Brunner proposed that perception is a constructive process rooted in meaning making. Our perceptual systems do not present to consciousness a copy of the external world, but instead construct these images, sounds, and other experiences, filtering the external world through our active meaning making processes. So within such a view, it's not surprising that our perceptions often do not match the objective characteristics of the world. The children in Brunner and Goodman's study should perhaps not be seen as making errors, but instead, their judgments were the outcome of seeing the world through their meaning-making processes, engaged as they were in the construction of money as either a plentiful or a valuable and scarce resource being held for them. So in conclusion then, in this lecture, I've put forward social constructionism as a radical challenge to mainstream psychology, one that questions many of the fundamental assumptions of the discipline. It invites us to question what it means to be a person, as well as what it means for psychology and to do psychology. Perhaps our response to this challenge should not be, is social constructionism right? Is it correct? But does it make us think? Does it make us challenge our common sense assumptions? And I think if it does do this, it is doing what science is really supposed to do. Thank you. Time for questions.
Viv, thank you very much for that. As you can imagine, your provoking and stimulating lecture has got quite a few people submitting questions for us. Let's try to do a few of these. Okay, the first question I thought I can't recall who it's from. Apologies for this, but the question is as follows. It says, as the structure of our language determines our perception of experience, do you consider it important to learn different languages?
That's a really good question. Well, I think learning different languages is always important. However, I do believe that that learning different languages exposes us to the fact that in other parts of the world is not carved up in the same way as it is for us. It is not, the same categories don't exist. Now that may or may not have any powerful impact upon us. For example, in France, I believe there's one word, mouton, which means both sheep and mutton that you might eat, whereas we have different words for that. We point to a sheep, but we say, but we eat lamb. Now that you may think, well, that's not a particularly earth-shattering conclusion. However, I think the important message that we draw from that is just that the other people in other parts of the world don't categorize the world in the same way that we do, and it just leads us to question whether the way we carve it up is a good way, is a useful way, but it alerts us to the fact that other people have different ways of doing it.
Right, thank you for that. Yeah, thanks for that answer. Now, I had a couple of people asking questions about this idea of subjectivity and objectivity, and I suppose what they were both leaning towards is the idea that if you're a social constructionist, should you give up on the idea of objectivity entirely?
I think I would largely say yes, though I think that when social constructionism, it views the way that we look at things as asking the question as to whether they're useful ways of looking at things, rather than are they the right way or are they the truthful way. And I think that can take us a long way. And sometimes, within, as it were, if we take a Wittgensteinian view and say, we have this language game of science, where there are certain rules that we observe about how the world works and about what processes we undertake and so on. And that language game of science, the language game of objectivity and of systematic observation of variation, when we manipulate variables and so on, that kind of way of thinking about the world, of accepting an objective and the idea of objectivity, has actually got us quite a long way. It gets us things like vaccines and so on, but it doesn't do often for people. When we're trying to deal in the realm of psychology, the idea of hard facts and of objective realities begins to be less useful. So I think, in certain circumstances, objectivity and hard facts, I'll play along with that and think, okay, well, it gets us some things that are useful for us. But in many situations, objectivity is not a useful idea.
So you're taking quite a pragmatic view there. You're saying if it's useful and has positive consequences, let's play along with it. Otherwise, we won't sign up to it, but we'll play along with it.
I think so, and I think objectivity, is as much a construction as anything else.
That's a fair point. Viv, another question here relates to this idea of human nature, and the question. Sorry, I don't have the name of the person, but they'll recognise it. Does social constructionism argue then that there is no such thing as innate nature? That personality is determined by interaction within a social context? So that was the question, and I'd just like to add to that: if are there certain things within our behaviour that you could say are certain propensities or abilities? If I'm brilliant at the piano, clearly I can do something that most people probably can't do. So would that not point to something being innate?
I think first of all, I think social constructionists wouldn't engage in the question about nature versus nurture for a start. That the idea that we have a personality or a set of characteristics that if we don't believe that they're provided by nature, well, they must have been provided by nurture. Then it says no, we don't have any personality anyway. It's a fiction. Now that's not to say it's clearly the case that that some people take to playing the piano easily. Some people take to building walls easily. Some people take to writing easily. However, all of these things, I think if you read what Rom Harre wrote about evidencing a skill, that it's as if to say, isn't it true that this person who built this wall was certainly skillful, weren't they? They must have had some sort of personal quality that enabled them to build this wall so skillfully. But you then start backtracking and say, well, what counts as a wall? What counts as having built a wall well? What counts as a skillful evidencing of a practice? And when you answer those questions, you can only answer them in social terms. They're what a social group or a community agrees is skillful, what they agree counts as a good wall or a wall for the purpose that it was built for. So I think you can never ever get back to, yes, that person has an inherent skill or ability or characteristic.
Okay, thank you for that. One or two more questions. Let's go and have a look at the list here. Let's see if I can pull another tough one for you. Hang on a second.
As if the others haven't been tough.
Actually, this is a tough one in a way. It says, the question, I think from Natasha, I might be wrong. It says, if we all have agency and choice, how does that relate to people with mental health issues such as schizophrenia?
I'm not sure I understand the question. Is the question about whether people with a mental health difficulty don't have agency or choice, or are restrained, or don't have freedom?
Presumably it's I'm just going to try and read into
Okay.
this. Let's assume there are certain cognitive impairments that might mean that people cannot choose. That's all I can read into that.
No, I would challenge that. It may appear to us from the outside looking in that they have no choice. But again, the social constructionist would argue that mental health conditions are social constructions like everything else. They're, if we look at the night sky and we see, this array of millions of stars, and then we say, oh, look, there's the plough. What we're doing is picking out, 7 or 8 stars that we're saying that forms a pattern. But what counts as a pattern? That's a human construction. And if we look at people and say, look, the constellation of their behaviors tells us, we call that schizophrenia. Well, in previous times, that wouldn't have been a label. Other parts of the world, that wouldn't be a label. It's a social construction. So I think that from the outside looking in, it can feel from a medical perspective, from a medical discourse, that people with mental health difficulties, if we can put those in inverted commas, have a condition that prevents them from doing things that other people can do. I think what we're just not seeing is that everybody operates within the same parameters of choice and agency, but they're just not making the choices that other people would make.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much for that. Another question coming up. Actually, I should just want to say at this point that the things you're saying are really, really useful, because I know all our first year students, one of the skills they're developing is this thing called critical thinking. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that social constructionism is a really good approach to developing these sort of different perspectives you can take on things. So one of the questions was, and this is a fairly simple question in a way, but I don't know, let's see. It says, how can you get people to see reality from many perspectives?
How can you get people to see reality from many perspectives?
Now, assuming that there is no one reality, right?
Okay, yes.
But I suppose, how do you get people to take perspectives? That's, I guess, would be the better way of putting it.
To take perspectives. Well, I guess through discourse and debate, I mean, we, through listening to others and taking seriously what they say. And that's not, when I say taking seriously, I don't mean believing it, hook, line and sinker, but taking it seriously in order to explore what mileage it might have, what usefulness it might have, what implications it might have, for other people, for themselves, and so on. So, you know, we're doing this all the time when, you know, when we practice psychology, you know, we're reading about different theoretical approaches to particular phenomena, to looking at different ways that things have been explained, and we're trying to make up our minds which is the best one. As a social constructionist, I would say we're trying to make up our minds which is the most useful one, not which is the right one. But we do that all the time. We do it by exposing ourselves to those other perspectives, and whether that's through dialogue, debate, through reading, doesn't matter. Exposure and, you know, and being prepared to consider other points of view. And, you know, I think we all have a tendency, and I count myself in this completely. We all have a tendency only to expose ourselves to things that we already agree with. You know, and that means that we can become baffled by and intolerant of views that are completely different from our own, and that have very different implications from our own. But I think, you know, I think our job really is to fight against that, and to try to allow ourselves to at least consider and take seriously other views of the world. I mean, I know there was, you know, I can't remember how long ago this was now, some time ago, when terrorist activity was beginning to be kind of in the consciousness of people. And I think some politician had put forward the view that, you know, that we should be listening to what terrorists, so-called terrorists, of course they don't call themselves terrorists, but what terrorists have to say about their point of view, because if we don't, we'll never understand where their actions are coming from. And if we don't understand them, we'll never be able to deal with them. And I think it created an outcry at the time, as if listening to what terrorists have to say was somehow indefensible, because we should just be trying to completely rid the earth of these people. And I think, you know, that is the wrong thing to do. I think, you know, if we don't take seriously other people's point of view, even if we radically disagree with it, we will never get insight into where they're coming from, and to consider, you know, alternative ways of looking at the world.
It's a bit like the words like radical or militant, isn't it? Anyone who is prepared to take action in a direct way is often labelled, given that label, simply because they're not using the channels given to them by mainstream society.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as we see at the moment with all the strikes in the offing.
Yeah. So yeah, anyone who wants a direct relationship to the world around them and is prepared to reach out and touch or grasp or whatever is probably going to be labelled.
Yes.
One more question, another question here. If I can just find. I mean, someone actually was asking about COVID-19, and I don't know, perhaps with your postgrad students, are there many different perspectives that people can take to COVID-19? Can you apply social constructionism to that?
Absolutely, you can. And I don't quite know where that question is coming from, but, you know, asking the question, is COVID-19 a social construction? Yes, it certainly is. In terms of, you know, if we think on the one hand about all the media attention that it's been given by politicians, by health experts, by ordinary people, which serve to construct it in certain ways, for example, as an enemy, or as a threat, or whatever, or as a, you know, as some, or as a natural occurrence. You know, we've always had pandemics. You know, this is just something that always happens. So certainly, COVID-19, as it's experienced by us, is certainly a social construction. But I would also say, I was thinking about this the other day, that, you know, if we take the idea of multiple perspectives to the nth degree, we could say that the human perspective on the world is a very partial one, that other animals and other organisms in the world have a very different grasp of the world, and that it's a kind of speciesism for us to be only looking at the world from the point of view of humans. So if you're a virus, You know, you don't see the pandemic as a jolly bad thing. You see it as your way of continuing. Or you probably don't have consciousness to do that anyway. But you know, if you could see the world through the eyes, if they had it, of viruses or bacteria, the world would look a very different place. And so, you know, COVID-19 wouldn't exist in any shape or form in the way that we see it as humans.
Yeah, and being able to take that imaginary perspective that you've just given there of a virus, if we can imagine a virus perspective, you know, that's all part of this thing called critical thinking, or as we call it in the first year courses, critical thinking. That ability to just step outside of one way of looking at something, just to look at it from another perspective or whatever.
Yes.
Final question from me. I don't know if anyone else has got any questions they want to type in, but it seems to me, Viv, that as a social instructionist, you have to, as a byproduct of that, or part of that, you are a historian of ideas, or a historian of constructs. So I was just wondering, are there any historical periods where you feel, you know what, I would have felt more at home in that period because the way they viewed things was more, I don't know, balanced or whatever, more in accord with whatever you prefer.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, we only have access to history as it's written in order to, you know, and history itself is a social construction. So whatever we read about, you know, the 15th century or the 16th century or so on, you know, is only through the eyes of the people who wrote it backwards. You know, but with that proviso, do you know what? I think I'd like to live in prehistoric times. I'd like to have lived in times before the sort of shared, you know, before society became capable of sharing concepts and ideas in the way that, you know, it is so so much a part of human life, but because they become so tyrannical, they can become so tyrannical. So maybe leading a simpler life where all you did was go and gather your nuts and berries and eat them with your family, and it didn't mean anything. I think that would have been rather nice.
Yeah, okay. I can't say I share that dream of yours, but anyway, thank you very much. We don't have any more questions, but thank you very much for being here today. Obviously, the psychology team will be in touch with you in due course about various things. But thanks very much for coming and doing this, and also thank you to, I think we had about at one point 84 students online, or 84 of us online, listening to you. So thank you very much to everyone who came along as well.
You're most welcome, Will, and thank you to everybody who did come and listen. Thank you. I hope you found it useful and interesting.
Lovely. I'm gonna stop the recording there. I'm going to stop the lecture there for now. And Viv,